You are listening to the Critical Hour. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
RT reports Iran comments on Israel attack. This is a response to Israeli killings of Hamas, Hezbollah, and IRGC leaders, Tehran has said. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Armed Struggle: Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California Through the 60s and 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
Quote, in response to the martyrdom of Ismail Haniyeh, Syed Hassan Nasrallah, and martyr Nil Khorasan, we struck at the heart of the occupied territories, end quote. The IRGC said in a statement released about 30 minutes after the first missile struck, quote, if the Zionist regime responds to our attack, our next strikes will be more destructive, the IRGC added. Dr. Horne, I think there are many who are misconstruing restraint with fear, and it seems as though up through this point, the Iranian responses have been incredibly measured and proportional, and they're letting everybody know, keep this up, and there's more where this came from. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, you have a valid point, obviously, and I think the ultimate commentary on this retaliation by the Iranians to these provocations by the Israelis is the scene from Tehran, the scene from Isfahan, even the scene from Gaza, where folks are literally dancing in the streets because, of course, they have been wishing for and hoping for some sort of measure to restrain the bloodlust coming from the war cabinet in Israel. These hundreds of missiles shot from Iran are just the opening gambit, if you listen to the Iranian leadership carefully. These were not cruise missiles. They were not even drones. They were ballistic missiles. And so Iran obviously has other tricks up its sleeves as it warned the Israelis. The wild card, needless to say, is the presence in that part of the world of the flotilla from the Pentagon. We are aware of the fact that Mr. Biden and his own war cabinet have been huddling in the Situation Room in the White House. We know that it is the fondest wish of U.S. imperialism to have an excuse to attack the Islamic Republic, because the Islamic Republic today is perceived as part of a so-called meddlesome quartet that includes Russia, China, and the Democratic Republic of Korea, that is to say, North Korea. And so this may provide an excuse for U.S. imperialism to barge into the war zone, to barge into the theater of conflict, and bring us closer, I'm afraid to say, to World War III.
The other part of it is, we've got a dock worker strike going on right now, which is certainly going to cause, inflation, going to cause economic problems. And to expand the war, the conflict in the Middle East, we've already seen reports from CNBC and Bloomberg that there's responses in the oil market. Well, if this goes bad, there almost won't be an oil market to have a response to. Your thoughts on the economic ramifications of what's going on here, and including the dock worker strike?
Well, the dock worker strike deserves multiple personalities to focus upon. Let me begin with the fact that the dock workers in the United States are split. On strike as we speak is the International Longshore Association, which controls the workforce in ports along the East Coast, stretching westward into Houston. But with regard to the West Coast, they're not on strike. Recall, they were on strike months ago. That's the International Longshore and Warehouse Association. And what's remarkable about this split in the labor movement is that it also reflects a political split, because the workers now on strike on the East Coast and stretching into Houston, the ILA, historically has been dominated by organized crime. And if you listen to the Justice Department, that continues to this very day. I'm speaking of their leader, Harold Daggett, who has been suspected of having mob ties. Of course, he is considered to be a comrade of the likewise mobbed up U.S. GOP nominee, speaking of Donald J. Trump. We recall, of course, that that particular split in the labor movement has been quite wounding to labor overall. A footnote is that when this split in the labor movement erupted some decades ago, despite the fact that West Coast Longshore, which was dominated by the left, dominated in no small measure by the Communist Party and their suspected comrades, speaking of Harry Bridges of Australia, that the NAACP chose to associate with the mobbed-up ILA rather than the left-leaning ILWU, despite the fact that the left-leaning ILWU was repeatedly on the front lines with regard to the anti-racist struggle. We also know that this split in the labor movement led directly to the Taft-Hartley Act of about 80-odd years ago, which was an anti-communist piece of legislation which would authorize the White House to break the strike by calling for a cooling off period. This strike of the ILA will also challenge and test the relationship of these Republican-leaning unions. I'm thinking of the Teamsters. Their leader, Sean O'Brien, spoke at the GOP convention. Recall that Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, a rising star in GOP ranks, has spoken of the GOP as a labor party. We will begin to see if that is just rhetoric, which I dare say it is, as opposed to something real. Obviously, the ILA, despite its political weaknesses, has wind in its sails because, as you noted in your opening comment, the White House would like to see this strike settled. It could lead to inflationary pressures built upon other inflationary pressures. The labor movement, the ILA, has a certain kind of leverage because of tight labor markets, because of the impact of Hurricane Helene on supply chains, that is to say, getting goods into the United States being disrupted in the Savannah port, in the Wilmington, North Carolina port, in the Norfolk, Virginia port, because of this disruption of the weather that gives them leverage. We also know that the bosses can afford to give wage increases to the workers. They have been enjoying billions of dollars in profits. What the union is asking for is rather mild in comparison to these billions of dollars in profits, a mere 77% wage increase over 6 years. The compromise that may result is the kind of compromise that you've seen eventuate in Rotterdam, a major port in Western Europe, which too has faced this question of automation. That is to say, the fact that workers are being retired and dismissed and replaced by machines. What happened in Rotterdam is that the workers were eased out with generous retirement packages. The problem in the United States is that labor, particularly the ILA, I'm afraid to say, does not have the kind of foresight or demonstrated historical militancy to work out that kind of agreement. And even if they were able to work out that kind of agreement, in the long term, given the present labor force generous retirement packages, means that younger workers would not be able to enjoy these wages that oftentimes are $40 an hour with regard to longshore workers. So this strike that's taking place right now is a real challenge and a test for U.S. labor and helps to underscore that now seemingly moldy aphorism that every strike is a dress rehearsal for revolution.
What are we to make of Joe Biden saying last year that he was such a pro-labor president? And we know what happened with the United Auto Workers, but we also know what happened with the West Coast strike. That's one question. And then the second part of the question is, when you look at the West Coast versus East Coast, and the fact it's the East Coast docks that are on strike because the West has already been settled. In terms of electoral politics and the electoral map getting to 270, how do you see Joe Biden deciding to sit this out? Is this going to have an electoral map impact?
It's difficult to say. With regard to New England, those are generally blue states. I'm thinking of Massachusetts in the first instance, and even Maine, to a degree, has a kind of blue state orientation. The question is, what impact will it have, for example, in North Carolina, in Wilmington, which is a swing state, for example? What impact will it have in Savannah, a major port in Georgia, for example? We also have to widen our lens and ask the question, will the companies shift their exports and imports from the East Coast to the West Coast and then put the containers on trains and ship them across the North American continent to the East Coast? What impact will this have on the Panama Canal? That is to say, exporters from Europe, oftentimes, of course, they would dock from Maine to Savannah. Will they instead go to the Panama Canal and then work their way to the West Coast, for example? What impact will this have on Canadian ports, for example, particularly the East Coast of Canada? This helps to underscore the fact that labor needs to be transnational and international, because obviously, if the ILA had been more energetic in organizing labor in Canada, they would not be facing the possibility that their strike could be undermined by simply shipping to East Coast Canadian ports. In any case, this is part of the calculation that labor is going to have to tally up if they are going to be successful. And I should also mention the adjunct to the docks. That is to say, historically, that is to say, in the past 6 to 7 decades, the bosses have been quite adroit at disrupting the organizing of ships. Ships used to be dominated by the militant left-leaning National Maritime Union. Ships now are little more than floating slums. Inevitably, that has a knock-on effect in terms of the workers who unload the ships, speaking of the dockers. And so if the International Longshore Association was live, it would pour part of its treasury into reviving the flagging and lagging fortunes of the National Maritime Union, so that could then lead to the ship workers, for example, having a solidarity strike with the dockers.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.